Les gars, c'est dit qu'ils connaissent les gars qui disent que les gens disent que si les gars disent que c'est la voiture blanche, c'est pour eux. Les gens disent que la voiture blanche, c'est pour eux.
Je dis que c'est pour moi qu'on a déjà commencé.
Okay, good morning and welcome to this side event that's being held in the margins of the IMF and World Bank spring meetings. My name is Jason Braganza. I'm the Executive Director at the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development. Before we get started, just one additional administrative matter on for those in the room, the devices that you have for your interpretation. I've been requested to give you a quick demo so you can tell me as part of your feedback of this session how good my demonstration skills are. So I'm going to stand right here. There is a button in the middle here that you have to press and hold for about 3 seconds. And when it turns green, it means it's on, and it should already be set to channel 1, which will be able to give you the interpretation in English for those who need it. And just to let our friends and colleagues who are online to also note that there is simultaneous interpretation available for you as well, and you just need to choose your language option. So, without much ado, allow me to first of all thank all of those who are here with us in the room, but also those joining us virtually for making time to be with us to discuss an issue that is extremely important in the context of the African continent. The debt crisis, no matter which way you would like to define it, whether it is a solvency issue or a liquidity issue, is something that is really gripping the entire continent. And when we look at how the impact of it is translating to the ability of our governments to find not just the fiscal space to meet their development objectives and meet their operational objectives, but also the policy space to be able to make those decisions is very much shrinking, given the kinds of pressures on the fiscal side, but also the kinds of demands that are being made on our governments in order to find ways of appeasing the creditors and ensuring that debt servicing obligations are being met. And so, we are at a time and at a juncture also where the world is also confronted with an extremely erratic or haphazard political climate that one does not fully understand how to react nor how to strategize, because the erraticness of it means that you're always in the wait and see mode, and for a continent as vulnerable but also that has so much promise like ours, we need to find out and figure out what are the ways that we can go through this. The G20 Common Framework, which was designed and sort of came to life during the global pandemic of the COVID-19 global pandemic, is now the prevailing instrument or process that is there for supporting countries that need to restructure their debt. But as is publicly acknowledged and known, that there are severe shortcomings with this process, one of it being that it has been and continues to be quite a very lengthy, drawn-out process for the countries that decide to enter the common framework. The second aspect is that it is very limiting in the scope of creditors that are able to, that are supposed to be part of this restructuring process. And thirdly, it continues to emphasize the role of the International Monetary Fund in two ways, which often can be interpreted as being a conflict of interest. You have the IMF as a creditor, but it's not part of the restructuring process, but you have the IMF also as the mediator, who often is viewed as playing the role of supporting the provisions or the interests of creditors. So the session we're having here today is to try and discuss what is the common framework in today's landscape, the political inconsistencies and uncertainty, but also at a time when we've got emerging crises where African governments are having to think very long, deep and hard as to whether they should publicly state that they need to enter a restructuring process. There's many African governments that are tapering on the edge of this debt crisis and debt default, but are very hesitant to enter the common framework for some of these weaknesses that I've just mentioned. And with me to go through that and whether we can advance some sort of alternative process that is a bit more democratic, that is a bit more participatory, but more importantly, that gives a bit more sovereignty and agency to debtor countries on the continent to coordinate. I'm joined here by a very distinguished and experienced panel who are also the co-organizers of this wonderful side event with me. So we have Dr. Hannah Ryder, who's the founder and CEO of Development Reimagined, and who are also the curators of this very innovative Focus on Africa Week that is being held here in the margins of the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, and a big kudos for that initiative. I think we should do a lot more of this, and especially here in this wonderful building of the African Union. I'm also joined by Professor Ohio Omihunu, who is the editor of the Afronomics Law and is also with the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. Mr. Kamal Ramburuth, who's the G20 project lead at the Institute of Economic Justice, and Mr. Joseph Matola, who's the acting head of the Economic Diplomacy Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs. So you're all very welcome. Thank you very much for making time. Just to give you a sense of how we're going to run the discussion today, we're going to have some framing questions that our speakers are going to take us through, and each of them will have about 5 to 7 minutes to give us their initial thoughts on the questions that have been posed, and then we'll have a second round, and then hopefully we'll have an opportunity to hear from you in the audience, those who are online, but also those who are here in the room, in terms of comments, questions, or clarifications. So we will try to keep this to about an hour if we can, because we have, I know we all have other engagements starting from around mid-morning, around 11 a.m. And I know for those who are online, thank you for your patience. We've kept you already much longer than we should have done already. So without much ado, thank you very much. I'm going to kick off with Hannah, if you don't mind. We've heard this week from the IMF Managing Director a rather bleak short to medium-term outlook for the continent, with the debt crisis still very much at the center of many governments' policy agenda. Of course, on the continent, we've had 4 defaults: Chad, Zambia, Ghana, and Ethiopia, and a lot more tapering on the edge of default. So Kenya, Senegal, Malawi, to name a few. In this sense, is the common framework working for the continent and her citizens in the prevailing economic and political climate?
Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you to yourselves and the other co-organizers of this event, and the DR team, of course. Really pleased to be here, and really pleased that we have also been able to pull together a series of events which really draw on the key themes that many of our governments are really here to negotiate and achieve progress on here during the IMF and World Bank spring meetings. You asked a very direct question: is the G20 common framework working for our continent? And I think despite the work by the G20 themselves and sort of, in a sense, marking their own homework, in which they would say, yes, it's gone fine. And we saw the release also of a new playbook yesterday for G20, for countries who may be eligible for the G20 Common Framework, but also for others who are not eligible, and what they could try to do to go through this process. I think the direct answer is it's not working. The evidence is very clear that it's not working, and there's also very good reasons why it's not working. So if we look at the evidence, as you mentioned, Jason, we have had those 4 defaults, very different cases. The case that went through first was Chad, involving a private sector negotiation, primarily linked to natural resources, very problematic kind of debt structure. And I think when you look at the results of that negotiation and going through the common framework, although that was sort of, in a sense, the easiest case, again, if you look at what are the outcomes for Chad, you look at the net present value and so on, and in a very technical sense, it's not significantly different to where Chad was. And we couldn't easily say, especially in terms of a development impact, that the G20 Common Framework has had a positive development impact on Chad, for instance. Zambia, going through the case, and I think Zambia is, the one that's normally talked about because it's really just, but also Ghana, Ethiopia. The governments have had to work so hard to try to make the best out of the situation, but the length of the process has been extremely challenging, far too long. Again, in a development impact sense, countries like Zambia, Ethiopia, their development has effectively been put on hold. And even having to go through some of the austerity programs from the IMF have created challenges, not as many challenges as some countries like Kenya, who haven't gone through the process but have still had to go through IMF. It's just extremely difficult to see why any other country would choose to go through this process if they had a choice. And I think the reason why the Common Framework hasn't worked for the continent, we have to go back to the basics. You mentioned one point, Jason, around the IMF and the conflict of interest with the IMF as the mediator, and I think that's absolutely spot on. It's highly problematic. But interestingly, we're in this environment at the spring meetings here, where there is considerable uncertainty about the role of the IMF and the World Bank going forwards, in this, especially with the view of the current administration in the US. What do they really want? One thing it seems that they do want is for the IMF to maintain that role. That was very clear from Scott Bessent's speech yesterday. So we need to be really aware of that view from the IMF and the World Bank's largest shareholder. But that is one issue. But there are other issues, and I think the most fundamental issue is that, or two of the most fundamental issues, but they're linked, is the moral hazard basis of the Common Framework, the assumption that borrower countries have been borrowing badly and that they've not been doing good things with their debt. fundamentally underlies the common framework and the Paris Club that came before it. And there's no challenge to that assumption whatsoever in this existing environment. And then the second linked issue is the fact that the borrower really has extremely low agency, including not being in the room during the final negotiation. And that in itself is just extremely, one, surprising to most people when you think about what a common framework should be, a debt resolution framework should be in principle. But it really embodies this idea that, you know, debtors have not done the right thing. And what we do know, the reality is that most countries who do take debt, yes, you've got some challenges around the edges, but especially with the amounts involved, they're really scrambling and doing their best to use debt in a positive way. So I think this is, you know, the answer is no, and I think these are the reasons why. And it's really hard because quite often we're at the kind of tinkering around the edges, but the fundamental problems with the common framework are fundamental ones. And how do we get? Are we in a space where we can really disrupt those systems? Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Hannah, for framing it that way. And I think just, you know, I want to bring in Ohio here, building on what Hannah said very succinctly and very correctly, and I agree totally, that it's broadly not working for the reasons she's mentioned. But in addition, it does have omissions, the framework itself, in terms of which creditors can participate. And, you know, Africa is not a country. It's a continent that has 55 countries and very different creditor compositions. And one of the complexities that the common framework does not address for the continent is where you have a majority creditor portfolio that is IFI or multilateral in nature. A case in point is Malawi, or you've got the idea where, you know, middle-income countries, you know, cannot access the common framework, and there are those also on the continent. And so with the framing that Hannah has put there, I mean, do you think, or, you know, what are then the alternatives we should be thinking about? Because again, this does undermine very much the centrality of what the spirit and principles of a debt restructuring process should look like. So how should we deal with that kind of stuff?
Okay, thank you, Jason. Yes, and that's an excellent question, building on what Hannah's just highlighted about the obvious failings of the system, and it brings to the fore the reality that, and the elephant in the room, which we keep avoiding, is that it's not fit for purpose, the current ad hoc fragmented structure that is in place. I mean, obviously, if we go back to origins in the post World War II settlement, I believe that it was a grave error to have gone with the Bretton Woods as against the Dumbarton Oaks in institutions with respect to where we should situate issues around, debt and debt restructuring. You mentioned Malawi and the fact that Malawi is faced with the dilemma of having very significant debt, distress, but it is unable to use the system. You also mentioned, obviously, that middle-income countries are also excluded. But, I mean, for Malawi, the interesting bit is that over 33% of its debt is owed to multilateral MDBs and IFIs, which brings to the fore something that perhaps has been a little bit ignored in the conversations for a while. The reason why they are exempted from or excluded from the process, because in itself it's not supported in international law, or it's just perhaps a convention that has kind of existed, which then draws us back, brings us back to the idea that the IMF is operating in multiple roles and in many ways seems to be clinging on for relevance. In a system or in a process that it obviously is not able to fully deliver on. And it has its wonderful uses, the IMF, and I believe that perhaps this is a good time for us to really consider the extent to which the conversations about, having a better structured system under the UN framework is more appropriate to deal with the growing and more really debilitating situations with debt across the African continent and across the world in general. So back to Malawi, for instance, as I mentioned, that 30% of its debt is owed to multilaterals. So even though it owes some to bilaterals, private, we've focused so much on private creditors and getting them to the table for a while now, but we're seeing that what about the multilaterals? How do we get them to the table? Why are they excluded from the table as well in terms of the relief process? Now, obviously, they do have that justification in terms of maintaining their business model, not being downgraded in terms of their ratings. But I mean, there are workarounds around this, and it's possible. So in essence, just the same way when it comes to states, when we talk about issues of political will, the question is, what would it take for MDBs and IFIs to actually engage with this process? Because it is obvious that if countries, and Malawi is just one of such countries, there are 20-something countries thereabout who fit this profile that have over 50% of their debts owed to MDBs and IFIs. And so if this chunk is excluded from the process, then in essence, there is no basis or no real relief coming to Malawi and countries like Malawi, and they would remain on that cliffhanger and have that debt overhang. Also, when you then talk about alternatives, and Hannah's already mentioned this, a lot of what's happening is just drinking around the edges, peripheral attempts at trying to patch a system or a process that is clearly not fit for purpose. And we keep kicking the can down the road. But we need to have the very difficult conversations. And I mean, we've had some admittance, from the MD of IMF about the failings. And I remember an article that the MD wrote in, I think that was 2022, in the Journal of International Economic Law, talking about the growing mandate or the evolving mandate of the IMF. And in many ways, it did appear that this was a very concerted effort of the IMF to try and continue to justify its role or the centrality of its role in this process. But I think we can learn a lot from insolvency process, as it relates to corporates, and this would not fly in terms of, we have an arbitrator or a system outside or external to the process that is able to stand independent and, coordinate this. And the IMF cannot legitimately continue to carry out this role. And so this, in many ways, touches on not only its social legitimacy, but its even normative legitimacy at this point in time. So in summary, I think we are really in a position for a hard reset on many issues around this. And I hope that the Finance for Development Conference, for instance, becomes an important moment where we're able to perhaps move away from just these conversations and rhetoric to actually seeing what alternative ways are more meaningful for countries like Malawi and other countries in Africa that are going through debt distress.
Thanks very much, Ohir, for that. And again, a very important point here about the potential for, a hard reset of the system and where the opportunities do lie. And I think it's also worth noting here that in the early 2000s, during the Jubilee debt campaign for debt cancellation, the MDBs did offer full debt cancellation through the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative. And, the analysis and the assessment as to the extent to which these MDBs were negatively impacted by embarking on that is out there, and to a very large extent it's not. They were not impacted. The shareholding capital did not change. Their ratings did not change, and more importantly, our very own African Development Bank was involved in providing a significant amount of debt cancellation under the MDRI initiative. And I mean, part of this is what brings me to my question to you, Kamal, because the government of South Africa is the president of the G20, where this initiative originated from, and it's not necessarily a large creditor country under its presidency, but has perhaps the level of expectation or the weight of expectation of an entire continent on its shoulders in trying to provide some sort of direction, guidance, leadership also on the idea of what the debt restructuring should look like. From your perspective, working on this very closely with the South African administration, are there opportunities in this South African presidency that can move the needle somewhat on changing what the common framework might look like?
Thank you so much, Jason. It's a pleasure to be on a panel with you all, and thank you for coming. I know it's a very busy week, so it's a real honor to be sharing this moment with you all. Thank you. I'll quickly go through what the plans are for the year around the G20 and the common framework. The first is something that Hannah already mentioned, which is a kind of G20 policy note that tries to provide a stronger explanation of what the common framework process is for debtor countries, and that's an attempt to try to start to fix the information asymmetry problems that are an initial barrier to countries accessing the common framework. You won't go through a debt restructuring process if you're unsure that it's changing all the time and you don't really know what that'll entail. So that's one barrier that kind of has been undertaken. The second is there's a plan to publish non-confidential information on the common framework cases on both the Paris Club and the G20 websites. And in addition to that, there was an event hosted in March during the G20 finance ministers meeting, before that meeting, with 14 African countries, including Zambia, Ghana and Ethiopia, where there was a kind of sharing of experiences of African countries in relation to undertaking the common framework, but also from a lot of countries who didn't undertake it, and asking the question, why? And I mean, for a lot of us here, that answer is quite obvious, is because a lot of African countries and countries in the global south in general, are afraid of the impact of credit rating downgrades and of the stigma associated with restructuring, even if the overall impact of that on the economy is less. There's too many uncertainties around that. So these are the opportunities, but of course these opportunities are definitely not enough to relieve the levels of debt distress that are currently faced by the continent. Jason, you mentioned a few of the shortcomings already, that the G20 common framework is slow, it's unclear, there's insufficient debt relief, there's weak enforceability of comparability of treatment, there's a lack of creditor participation, there isn't a link often to development goals, and there's limited country coverage. And for this, the Institute for Economic Justice, along with Boston University, have developed a piece around diverting development and the G20, where we make a number of proposals around what can be done for each and every one of these shortcomings. So, for example, we propose that for the slow and unclear process, there needs to be a streamlining of negotiations by applying a group solution to all countries in debt distress during the systematic crisis, rather than this case-by-case approach. The systematic approach is also important because there are serious power imbalances when small countries go one by one to the biggest countries in the world who own their debt. And this always will lead to an unfair outcome for developing countries. So a streamlining of the negotiations is important. And here an incentive as well. Perhaps something like a 2-year debt service standstill with no accumulation of interest arrears is something that should be seriously considered. This standstill would also be useful in focusing creditors, because if they're not earning interest in that time, they'll be forced to come to the table, and that can help to deal with the holdout creditors that often slow down the process. When it comes to insufficient debt relief, I think it's important here that the DSA is updated to include both the projection of investment needs to reach the SDG goals and climate risks. When it comes to weak enforceability of comparability of treatment, we need to create some kind of fair comparability of treatment rule that accounts for ex-ante risk pricing in lending practices of private creditors and ex-ante concessionality of multilateral lenders. So in other words, those creditors who are lending with private creditors in particular with a far higher interest rate that's supposed to embed the risk of default, they need to take a bigger cut than creditors that are offering highly concessional rates, because that is in essence ex ante concessionality. When it comes to the lack of creditor participation, what we're proposing here is different lenders often want different kinds of treatment, right? So it isn't the case that no lenders want no cuts whatsoever, but I think that the flavor, it matters, right? So for official creditors, for example, we could think about a 10 to 20 year reprofiling with reduced interest rates. For banking institutions, we could consider things like Brady bonds. For multilateral creditors, we could consider a backstop of their potential losses through the replenishment of the debt relief trust fund and selling a fraction of IMF gold, which is something that Jason mentioned during the MDRI. MDBs did take a cut, but they took a cut because there was a replenishment of the debt of kind of debt relief funds. Finally, I mean, of course, linking debt relief to development goals is fundamental. We need to design a country-owned growth-enhancing investment-led plan based on national determined contributions and SDGs. And of course, I mean, I think it's something that the panel will come to again and again. But if we don't think about debt relief in connection to development and in connection to things like food sovereignty, in connection to technological sovereignty, in connection to energy sovereignty, the debt crisis will come again and again every couple of decades or sooner. So we have to embed that thinking into any kind of debt relief processes. And then finally, it's really important to expand the eligibility of common framework of the countries that can access it to include middle income countries. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Kamal. And I will encourage, I don't usually do this, but I will encourage us to look at that paper. I've heard a lot about it this entire week. Marina has been presenting it in various forums. And I think the point around the gold reserves actually is the computation that she did, or you guys have done on that on gold reserves, is very fascinating. And I'd encourage us to get hold of that. I want to bring in Joseph here now, because I mean, you've heard from Hannah, Ohio, and Kamal that there's very clear evidence and an indication that the common framework is not working, is not fit for purpose. It was developed at a time when we needed something very urgent, and something that would respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. And like with most initiatives, sometimes they're good at that moment in time, and then they run their course and sometimes don't enrich their expiration date. And I think that's the question I want to pose to you: is do you think where we are today at this moment in time, the current economic and political climate that we are faced as a continent in the international order, that the common framework has really reached its sell-by date, and perhaps it is now time to consider something different, something more progressive, something a bit more democratic that enhances the agency of the continent in debt restructuring?
Thanks, Jason, for that question, and my apologies for for coming very late. Technology kind of let me down, and I was moving around Washington, D.C. trying to locate this venue. But I'm happy to be here amongst this panel, and thanks to the audience for coming. So regarding your question whether the common framework has reached this sell-by date, I think my answer to that is a simple yes. I'm of the view that it's time to pull the plug on the whole common framework initiative. I think the solutions that have been provided by my colleagues regarding how we can try to improve it, I think they're the best solutions that we have if we are going to maintain the common framework. But as far as I'm concerned, we're at a point where we have a patient that we have been resuscitating for the last couple of hours, and it's time to face reality. 3-4 years on, and I think we can point to one case where we can say that this is a success case under the common framework. And I think there are two ways. One is pulling the plug completely. The other, it would require very radical reforms that I don't even know if the consensus would be reached to implement such kind of radical reforms. There's been suggestions, for example, to have these mandatory participations in debt restructuring. I don't know how that can be achieved. It's, I think, an ideal situation to have everyone participate in the debt treatments of countries, but I just don't see it happening, especially in the current environment that we are in. Most of the lenders are, I mean, from private lenders from developing countries, and I don't know if the governments there would be willing to push for these entities to be involved in, I mean, to be forced to take up haircuts or whatever. So I do think we should be focusing now on other processes. I think we are at a point where countries like African countries, we are pretty much at a point where we were back in the early 2000s. And the only thing that I think can work is a similar initiative to what we had then, the HIPIC and the MDR initiatives. And after that, then we need to start dealing with fundamental issues that keep bringing us here. I think we need to address the issue of domestic resource mobilization from countries to make sure that we avoid accumulation of debt to unsustainable levels. We are seeing more and more countries now going back to the Eurobond market, contracting loans at 10%, 12%. I mean, even if we succeed in reforming the common framework, we will need another common framework somewhere in the near future. So I'm now a disbeliever a non-believer in the common framework. At this point, I do believe we should just completely scrap it and focus on the structural issues that keep bringing us here. Again, I mentioned domestic resource mobilization. There are issues that there are also other initiatives that are not necessarily asking somebody to give up their money. So, for example, International Tax Corporation, right? International Tax Corporation. You're trying to help developing countries mobilize their own resources through taxing these big multinationals that are notorious for profit shifting and tax avoidance. But these initiatives can help countries address their debt vulnerabilities without necessarily looking like you're begging you're begging others to contribute. The SDR rechanneling, those are initiatives that you're simply reconfiguring the resources that are already there, and they can help very much in improving the fiscal spaces of countries. So yeah, in short, my simple answer is I would pull the plug if it was up to me. Thank you.
Well, you and Kamal are very close to the people who can propose pulling the plug and that resuscitation is not working. Hannah, I'm cognizant you need to leave very soon, but before you do, there is an initiative, Development Reimagined, has been advancing for the last couple of years. I mean, one that I and Aphrodite really admire, around this idea of a borrowers club. And it sort of touches a little bit to one of the recommendations that Kamal has made in the paper about, this group approach. And perhaps, as trying to prefer solutions beyond what is a largely creditor-centric common framework, in terms of other platforms or other policy spaces, where can this borrowers club fit in, without being sort of drawn into the common framework? Are there other forums where we can then use this as a way of enhancing the agency of the continent in this way?
Yeah, really great question, and I also I want to come back to one of the points that was raised as well around resuscitation, etc. Because but let me speak a little bit about how the idea of a borrowers club fits into this discussion, because we tend to, as many of you all know, in Development Reimagined, and also, of course, even just with this organisation of the event and the Focus on Africa series, like coordination really runs through our DNA at Development Reimagined. We believe in coordination and collaboration, especially amongst African organisations, as a means to build our agency and strength. And I think that's where the Borrowers Club comes in. The main focus of it is on future financing, right? In terms of if you look at any of our material on it, the idea is very much building on the Grameen Bank, Muhammad Yunus's idea of small countries coming together to borrow together and use that as a means to reduce the cost of capital going forwards, right? We're all using this phrase cost of capital, so I'm gonna link it in here, right? So that people can also lodge. It is a means to reduce the cost of capital and actually get any access to capital, because that's, let's face it, for a lot of the issue, for many countries on our continent, the issue is not even the cost of care is access to capital, full stop, you know. So part of the rationale for the Borrowers Club is on that basis. But it can also be used as a means and a structure to be able to jointly negotiate with specific creditors. And I think that at least is a where you have borrowers together in the room, sharing information together, even just coordinating on their positions as to, you know, these are the kind, when we go out to Eurobonds, we always get 11% interest. How do we negotiate? How do we raise even a collective? How do we bring that down? What have strategies been to be able to do that in an effective way? When we negotiate with, you know, Chinese creditors, what are the best outcomes that we've been able to achieve, etc. There are means that a borrowers club or even just a group of countries together can work together. And we have seen some examples of that. Even you mentioned HIPC and the MDRI process. There was some coordination that took place, supported by one of the organizations that work in this space now, Development Finance International. They really helped to bring countries together to think about what would they try to achieve from the HIPC process. So I think this idea of kind of joint proposals from countries is a really good one, and of course it's the Borrowers Club idea, but I think, you know, we need to. The reason I wanted to come back to the point about resuscitation is because I think, you know, we're going towards FfD4. Governments are going to find it hard to say we want to, like, let's face it, they're going to find it hard to say that we don't want the common framework anymore. I think even if they don't want the common framework, they're going to find it hard to say that. So we need to put really good ideally, let's put some really good ideas on the table that can then take over immediately. We can spend some time and put the ideas there for, you know, how to make the common framework better, but remembering that if you do make the common framework better, that can also make it harder to change into something new. So the stronger that our ideas are for, you know, certain things like, you know, if the IMF is not the organization that's involved in mediation, who is the organization that's involved in mediation? What does that look like? Is it a borrower on behalf of other borrowers, for instance? I don't know, or is it the African Union? If it's, you know, there are questions as to, we do need to think through those sorts of practical questions, and I think that will make it easier for governments to be able to move forward with these sorts of proposals and insert them into the FFD outcome.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm very glad that you've brought in the FFD component here, because, you know, again, a very, very important year in terms of global processes, global discussions on reforming the entire international economic and financial architecture. And I think that's a very nice segue to bring in Ohio on the specifics. I think, you know, Hannah has really brought out the idea of what the Borrowers Club could be, but in terms of debt restructuring, what are the specifics you would say that we need to put on the table as alternatives, as, you know, as we ponder convincing our governments to pull the plug on trying to resuscitate the common framework?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Yeah, I mean, the idea of the Borrowers Club, you know, is excellent in principle. We've seen support, and Hannah talked about the role or the agency of African countries in being able to galvanize support around this kind of initiatives. And it's indeed very important, because one thing that people would always say to activists is that it's easy to deconstruct and complain about the system, but usually when they ask you what should be there as in its place, then there is silence. So it's easy to complain about the ineffectiveness of a system, but the alternative, that's where it becomes a little bit more tricky. And Hannah mentioned something in her first intervention about where the IMF seems to stand in terms of its the U.S.-IMF relationship and where the U.S. stands with respect to its position on IMF. And I watched an interview on Bloomberg with MD, and yeah, she was asked about whether or not the rumors of the U.S. pulling out are credible, and what is the IMF's plan to deal with that. And she gave 3 very interesting points why she believes the U.S. will not pull out. She talked about the fact that that they add value to the U.S. in terms of that they've in the last 2 years paid that they do well with U.S. money. Yes, interest of $3.1 billion in the last 2 years, and amongst the fact that also they are in D.C. So she does not see any reason why that they have a good relationship. So in many ways, African countries are an interesting to be aware that it's geopolitical, and there are lots of interests that are shaping what direction, whatever future or alternate plans or processes would look like. So, for instance, we've seen support from Pakistan, Egypt, and Nigeria calling for negotiations to be initiated on multilateral legal framework for debt restructuring, which would in itself require a global debt authority. And this is very important because at the end of the day, if we go back to the comparisons I made earlier on about the insolvency process in terms of corporates, and there are many lessons to be learned from there. But at the end of the day, we've kind of been on this trajectory where it appears that there are 2 very separate type of scenarios, but actually the principles are not so far off from each other, and so we need to be looking at models. So normally, if you're trying to restructure or to replace a system, you look at comparatives of systems which may not be necessarily on all fours the same, but where you can gain or learn lessons from. So I believe there's a lot we can learn from the insolvency process. So I mean, having, for instance, a global debt authority to oversee this mechanism, I believe would be an important step, and I'm happy to see that we are seeing support, for this demand from the African group and LDC group as well, among others. So in essence, as we posture and as we have this run up to the conference in Seville, we need to have and start to pull together this necessary back end consensus building around the mechanisms that we are proposing. Like my friend said, in terms of perhaps I'm still I'm pessimistic about the chances, but I believe that events like this and being able to have this conversation, and I'm looking forward to reading the study, really gives us the necessary impetus to be able to galvanize the agency of African countries. Hopefully, South Africa is able to also play a championing role in this regard. Hopefully. So yes, that would be one of my major alternatives that I believe is the more sustainable and ideal approach if we are actually going to have a system that is fit for purpose. And I really do hope that we can get the necessary political will around that.
Great. Thank you, Ohio. And again, I'm intrigued at the point that you've mentioned around insolvency processes, and I hope we can also find some time to explore, the fact that there is this misrepresentation that there are 2 distinct things that are happening here. And again, very useful because, ministers of finance from the continent have for a very long time been asking for a pause of the common framework. It is one of the more, ironically, but one of the more common positions that the ministers of finance have taken, and very consistent ones at the Africa finance ministers meetings of 2023, 2024, and again 2025 this year, that there should be a pause of the common framework and at least get some sort of review on how it is actually working, if it is working. And so, Kamal, I want to bring you back here and just press you a little bit because of your proximity to those who are able to, make things happen under this G20 presidency. I mean, is there appetite from what you've said, the paper that you guys have done, but is there appetite within the government system in South Africa to take on some of this specific recommendation by the African finance ministers, of which South Africa has endorsed as well, by the way. So, in your perspective, or from your perspective, is there that space? Is there that willingness under the South African presidency to look at it in a very comprehensive way?
Thanks so much, Jason. I think that it doesn't really matter because the G20 is a consensus space. And so even if you had half of the countries who wanted a complete overhaul, it wouldn't happen. Even if you had 17 of the 19 countries and say 2 of the largest creditors didn't agree, it wouldn't happen, right? So I think that in consensus spaces, pressure put on 1 or 2 countries is both unfair and unrealistic. And of course, I do believe that countries like South Africa this year, Brazil last year, Indonesia the year before that, India the year before that, and Indonesia the year before that, we could have asked the exact same question of every single one of those countries. And we did. And the answer is the same, is that it doesn't really matter what the host country thinks or wants. It is a consensus space, ultimately. And I think that, I mean, in this case, even if a developing country host of the G20 did want to guide official creditors in a certain direction, we have to be reminded of the percentages of debt held by certain creditors, right? And currently, bondholders own 25% of debt in Africa, right? And though that debt is held in jurisdictions in London and in New York. And if we don't fix that part of the puzzle, the official creditors' actions will be swallowed by the claims of those private creditors. So that's also a key part of the puzzle that we have to answer. So yeah, I'm sorry if that's a not as direct an answer as you wanted, but I think there's another point here around pausing the common framework, and what does that really mean? In my opinion, there hasn't really been a framework at all in the last few years, really, that's worked. So what are we pausing? We're pausing a non-system that doesn't really work anyway, right? And I'm not sure that that kind of analysis is useful here. I wouldn't see the common framework as a patient. I would see the common framework as the medical equipment that you use to save patients, right? And we can't pull the plug on the instruments that we are trying to create to relieve debt distress. The other point that I'll finish on here is that a lot of the recommendations that we are making in this report can be used in a UN process. So there's nothing that's said here that's unique to the G20 or to the common framework. These are principles and ideas and instruments that can be transplanted directly into a UN process, which I think is favorable because the UN is the most democratic, transparent, and open institution, and that it should be empowered to take on these issues, especially given that it isn't a creditor in the same way that the IMF is. Thank you.
Thanks, Kamal. You've said some very interesting things here, and I do want to sort of tie it in with the question I'm going to ask you, Joseph, about the complexity of consensus-based approaches. I mean, ideally that's the ideal, right? Everyone sits around the table and you agree on something, but when you get to items or issues that are extremely sensitive or that have large national interests at heart, what you end up doing is is, in the bid to achieve consensus, is settling for the lowest common denominator. And I think in that sense, as a continent, we tend to lose out. But the second part, particularly with the G20, is what it shows is the lack of democracy in its entire setup, right? It's only 20 countries, trying to convene and decide the direction of the entire world. So, Joseph, there is a legitimacy issue here around the role of the G20 plays in global economic governance and financial governance. And I just wanted you to pick up and maybe just build on what Kamal has mentioned here, that he's taken your point about resuscitating a patient to saying that actually there's no patient but it's equipment. So we have a non-democratic forum with faulty equipment that perhaps needs to be thrown away. But then also, we need to find our footing as a continent in a place where our voice actually matters. I mean, what are your reflections on that when it comes to the debt architecture, and what should we be aiming for as we move towards Sevilla, as we move towards supporting also the Jubilee year that has that was announced earlier this year from the Vatican and things like that. How should we ensure that this democratic direction where African voices is heard is delivered?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. And to be fair, although it's G20, to be fair, the AU has been included, so it should be representing 54 countries. South Africa is already there. So on paper, at least Africa is being now represented, and it has, I think we use the phrase, to have a voice. The question is, it's not just about having a voice, it's whether your voice is being heard. That's the most important thing. And I think we have already seen the rocky start that the South African G20 presidency has started with. Again, as the pessimist on this table, on paper, we should be seeing improved democratic processes within the G20 and the debt architecture, just by virtue of having South Africa and the AU on the table, trying to represent African interest. But I think if you look deeply, the power imbalances that are in there within the G20, I mean, I think the US will single-handedly water down or make the South African G20 very, very much less effective than it would have been. Again, it also speaks to the need for consensus that the G20 is set up to have. So again, I feel a bit pessimistic in terms of yes, we have the voice, but whether it will be enough to make the changes that are needed, I just don't know about that. I feel the UN way, having a UN-led debt framework, I think is the best way to go. That will ensure a bit more representation, given that at least in the UN processes, the arrangements that are there are a bit more binding than what we get from the G20. I think we need the Global Debt Authority. What setup this would take? Would it be in the IMF, which itself is having its own challenges? but a global debt authority where countries can seek can seek solutions from. I think it's very important. The UN already has some principles on responsible lending. I know the African Union is also proposing through the so-called African Borrowing Charter to make sure that there is the principle of responsible lending is there. I think it's a very important component. Again, because for me, my focus is moving forward. I think the common framework is already a not so useful initiative, but moving forward, we need to put these like principles for responsible lending in place to make sure that we don't get to this point again. Yeah, so let me leave it there.
Thank you very much, Joseph. And I want to actually just thank you very much for bringing in the role of the AU here. I think this is very, very important. I mean, we're being hosted in this wonderful building here in Washington, and it's extremely beholden upon us to emphasize the fact that, yes, the AU is part of the G20 now. It does have within it some very progressive proposals on how to deal with coordinating the continent when it comes to issues of debt restructuring, a common debt position. They're sort of building that. They do have, just last year they launched the African borrowers institutions, financial institutions. Sorry, they are working very closely with Development Reimagined on the Borrowers Club as well. So I think there is also that important role that we, as we convene, we could continue to also support the work of the African Union Commission in Addis, here in New York, through these global processes that continue to ensure that our agency is being advanced as a continent and for the betterment of achieving Agenda 2063, which is not too far away. And I think with that, friends and colleagues, I'm going to pause and give our panel a bit of a break and maybe see if there's any questions from the floor here. Please feel free to raise your hand, introduce yourself, and just direct your question to whomever you'd like. Or I'm not sure if there's questions online, but we'll start within the room. Sir, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Alberto Maresca from Georgetown University, Center for Latin American Studies. My question is related to the idea of the Borrower Club, which I think is extremely insightful. And my regional focus is Latin America, which has a very similar experience to African countries in terms of debt and tumultuous relation with the Bretton Woods institutions. I think that by the same token, we also need to talk about alternative IFIs, namely the MDB in China, which are giving fresh insights and new opportunities to several Global South countries. For Latin America, it is quite difficult to approach the NDB because of the relation that ties the region with the US. And with tariffs in place, this makes this interaction much more difficult because the risk of retaliation is extremely high. But I think that there could be opportunities for cross-regional cooperation between Africa and Latin America in order to approach the NDB, in order to approach mutual cooperation between the regional organizations we have. We have the African Union, we have CELAC, we have the Mercosur. How feasible you think in the next 5-10 years fostering ties between Africa and Latin America in terms of advancing a new debt, financial, infrastructural, and therefore political agenda? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And I like your question on the Borrowers Club and the link to Latin America. I think if you're a student of history, you'll know that there was the Cartagena process many years ago that tried to do something like that. And, well, let's just say there were factors that made sure it did not happen. But you know, like many developing regions, we're undeterred from trying to do that, and I do think there are lots of lessons from that experience. Any other comment or question that I will come back to the panel? Yes, Alfonso.
Good morning, everybody. Alfonso Abicella, Caritas Internationalis Vatican City. And thank you, everyone. I think it's been incredibly enriching. I'd actually like to pick up on the question from Hannah and also from the gentleman behind me around the Borrowers Club. I think it's a very interesting question. And my point is about the brokering role of the African Union. So how likely do you think that would be if a borrowers club could be or would be brokered through the African Union concretely towards FfD4, G20 and in the future? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do have a question that's come in online from Senegal around the debt restructuring, and the question is, how can we ensure that the restructuring programs that countries undertake through the IMF and the World Bank do not undermine public investment in SDG-related sectors? And the second one is a comment about the AU and other institutions on the continent should take initiative about how critical the debt situations tends to be on the continent. So I know Jade is here from Development Reimagined, and we'll certainly, I don't know if you want to respond on the Borrowers Club or do you want to take that to Hannah, but I'll leave that to your discretion as a co-convener of this session. But let me just say something around the role of the African Union, because this is something that they have, I must say, have really tried to do, and under very difficult circumstances, given the divergent views that different countries have on how they want to address their debt situation. As Ohio and Kamal had mentioned, a big chunk of this is political rather than technical. A lot of the countries understand that they are facing a significant debt challenge and debt crisis. However, it's the political optics of what that admission looks like. And the African Union, to its credit, has tried to do things like call for the establishment, for example, of an African debt monitoring mechanism, which has a resolution within and mandate in a resolution form for its establishment. AFRODAT and a few others have been working with the African Union Commission to see what that debt monitoring mechanism could look like and how it would be able to support the initiatives such as the Borrowers Club. They did launch last year, like I mentioned, the African financial institutions. They are trying very hard to implement the Abuja Treaty, which calls for the establishment of an African central bank, an African monetary fund, and so on. And they have been progressive steps that have been made towards this. Later on this year, and I am going to have to ask the AU for like a sales commission here, because I'm really promoting their work. They have a conference in Togo coming up in a couple of weeks in Lomé, where it's an African debt conference. I think it's the first one that they've ever done, and it promises to at least have within it the opportunity to bring together ministers of finance from across the continent to talk about what that's actually going to look like, and hopefully it will give some impetus to the negotiations that are currently going on under the Financing for Development, towards the Financing for Development outcome under the debt chapter specifically. But I didn't want to hog up trying to respond to the questions, because I think I just wanted to chime in a little bit on the AU stuff. But maybe Kamal, Ohio, Joseph, Jade, are you good? Do you want to take some stuff on the Borrowers Club before I come back to the panel?
you've pretty much said what I was going to say on Lomé, actually. So there is already that coordination starting to take place, and we've also seen, there are other organisations as well that are taking this forward. So from OSC, we have the Common Leverage and Union of the Borrowers. So different places are kind of popping up with these different coordinations as well. But I think it'll be interesting to see what comes out of Lomé as well. I think that's everything.
Awesome, thank you very much. So maybe, as we also start to wrap up, so maybe we'll do Kamal, Ohio, Joseph. As you respond to that, maybe also give us your 45-second elevator pitch for the intergovernmental process that will lead to a UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt.
Okay.
In Seville.
Jason is like the IMF. He's both a negotiator and a creditor, and a debtor, and a panelist, and a moderator, and no. Thank you very much for your question. I think that your question about the new development bank is important because there's a fundamental question that we need to ask, not just about restructuring debt, which is what we've been discussing today, but about new financing. And if there are modalities of new financing that don't have to follow the old prescripts of the Washington Consensus or the Wall Street Consensus that we're seeing now. And I think that the new development bank is interesting in that sphere because most of the lending has been to state-owned enterprises, and the NDB lending doesn't come with any conditionality. So those are two very key modalities of lending that the NDB has that, for example, the World Bank doesn't. And I think that that's an exciting prospect. There's a few challenges with the NDB at the same time. The one around Latin America that you're raising is that the only Latin American country that the NDB lends to is Brazil, because it's a BRICS country. The NDB is owned by BRICS countries, and with the BRICS Plus expansion, there will be new countries entering in and making contributions of capital and callable capital to the bank and its expansion. But we will wait to see how that expansion happens, and I'm aware that there's a number of challenges around that. Yeah, and then I think around the Borrowers Club, I've already mentioned it, but the conversations and negotiations that center around a Borrowers Club have to integrate the core kind of deficits that lead to structural pressures on the balance of payments of global south countries. So it needs to integrate into its DNA conversations around energy sovereignty, around food sovereignty, and around technological sovereignty. Because if those three elements are not integrated, the same cycles of balance of payments, pressures will occur on African countries for time, forever, right? Thank you.
Awesome, thank you very much. Oh, here.
Yeah, I haven't had much time to read on the Borrowers Club, but I think a key thing that I picked up from what Hannah mentioned and the intervention so far is, number one, two things are very clear. Coordination is key, and I think that links to your question as well in terms of what role can the AU play in this regard. And that also links to the question that my friend mentioned about what, number one, lessons as well as what kind of synergies can we have across regions, within the Global South, South cooperation, to be able to build this momentum. And perhaps we can look back in history and look at examples. Jason mentioned one, but we can also look at the fact that even where there have been attempts to, not to scupper this attempts of building consensus around policies that are Global South focused, we must not lose sight of the partnerships as well as the sense of community that came in those collaborations. So if you look at, for instance, the guiding principles on sovereign debt restructuring, and you look at the voting patterns, and say how the voting patterns were, and it in many ways shows you the structure or the polarization of in terms of geopolitical posturing around these things. But we can't be defeated, or should I say, be too pessimistic, even though this didn't appear to be successes. Because if we keep that momentum in terms of the coordination, we can in many ways have leverage and a counterbalance to what already is a very difficult space, whether within the G20 or the existing frameworks. Whereas my colleagues have already mentioned, there's more that meets the eye than we can see from outside. So even though, yes, it appears it's consensus-based, but we know that there are some voices are more powerful than others. Yeah. And so the only way to be able to break that kind of hegemonic hold is to be able to leverage on this kind of synergies across regions. So I do welcome the idea you've mentioned, and I also believe that the AU, this is an opportunity for the AU. And so Jason has done a good job in showing how the AU can maximize this opportunity, and I hope that it does, bear some dividends in that regard.
Thank you very much, Ohio. Joseph, your sort of reflections on the questions, and maybe if we can also answer the one from Senegal about how do we protect social investments during restructuring, and then your elevator pitch for an alternative space, perhaps outside of Washington.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, on how we protect development goals or social goals, I think I agree with Kama that we shouldn't lose sight on energy security, on matters of social investments, and I think the NDB is kind of doing a good job in ensuring that development financing is going into such areas. I think I remember we were looking at the case of the South African Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Procurement Program, which the NDB has financed, has co-financed some of the projects under that program, what they're focused on is trying to build a lot of partnerships with local financing institutions, using the local procurement processes, using the local systems, and trying to make sure that it's very transparent. And they've ended up financing a very important project for South Africa, a country that has been having problems with its energy sector. So I think that is important, and trying to make sure that we're financing those important sectors, because what we need is to have countries benefit or achieve economic growth from the loans that they're taking. I think that's a very important part. We've been talking about Malawi. I've worked in Malawi government because I'm originally from Malawi, actually, and I know that the problem, some of the problems that you have seen is if you measure the loans that have been contracted by the government, most of which are concessional, yeah, and you measure that against the development that has happened, it just doesn't match. And the other aspect that I think we haven't spoken to is that Malawi has also a lot of domestic borrowing, which just crowds out the private sector, and you end up in a situation where growth is not supporting debt repayments and so on and so forth. So I agree with the question from Senegal that we need to make sure that when we're working out these debt restructurings, or when IMF is coming up with its initiative, we need to make sure that these are initiatives that really are benefiting development goals of the countries, and that will help that in the future we don't have to, we don't find ourselves in the same situations. Thank you.
Great. Great. Thank you very much for those reflections and closing remarks. I'm not going to attempt to summarize, but just to add one bullet point to Joseph's response to the colleague from Senegal. Look, when you're restructuring, it's a negotiation, right? You're at the table, you need to know what your development priorities are, you need to know what your citizens' priorities are, and the playbook is always the same with this restructuring. It's divert resources to ensure the creditors are fine. If you find yourself struggling to find those resources, increase taxes, it's increased DRM. The way to increase DRM is to increase taxes, and it's mostly direct and indirect taxes. It's not economic activity, it's not economic development or industrialization or anything of substance. It's just expand the tax net. Right, so the playbook is very simple, and we've been using it. It's been used for decades. So there is a negotiation there that can be said. Ring fence your social spending, and say, you know, X% is what we're protecting, and we're not going to divert any of that, or trade it off and say, well, if you want us to give up this, we're not providing tax incentives that's going to bring in foreign direct investment. I think it's time. We do have agency in these negotiations, in these discussions. I think the question for us is, how do we politely but strategically also encourage our governments to use that agency in those negotiation opportunities. And just finally, just to say that, you know, the idea of democratizing this entire conversation and how debt restructuring is done is one also about increasing voice in how global economics, global trade and finance is actually undertaken. We cannot continue for the next 30, 40 years being told Africa has so much potential, has a youthful population, has natural resources, but languishing in poverty. What's the problem, right? So if it's not working in Washington, let's go up the road to New York, where our voice is a bit more powerful, because we have, you know, numbers, and, you know, democracy is a game of numbers, and we can use those numbers, as we've done with the UN framework. The UN framework on international tax cooperation. The Africa Group, as all you have mentioned, is working tirelessly to ensure that democracy is upheld in that sense, and that the voices of the majority is what is prevailing in transforming what global economic governance looks like. Even in this very tumultuous current environment, it's temporary, we hope. And I'll conclude by saying this as well, that as we do continue advocating for reforms, for progressive reforms, for agency, in this very tumultuous climate, let us not get stuck in defending the status quo, given the complexities that we're facing today. It would be highly remiss of ourselves to decide to defend the status quo and abandon our very progressive message and very progressive ideas. So the idea here is also to, let's stick the course. Some of these bumps are temporary, if democracy is to be believed, and we will come back. So these are just temporary hiccups. So let's not be diverted too much to trying to then defend the status quo and abandon the very progressive ideas that we have. And with that, friends who are online, ladies and gentlemen who are here, please let us give our panelists a round of applause for a very wonderful session. And thank you all very much for being with us here this morning. There are tea, coffees, and refreshments upstairs. And thank you once again to Develop and Reimagine for this wonderful initiative of Focus on Africa Week during the spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of the day.